Hello and good evening. I'm Melissa Idris.
And I'm Sharad Kuttan.
You're watching Consider This, the show that wants you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. Let's start with news that Fahmi Fazil, the Communications Director for PKR, told Sina Harian that Pakatan Harapan does not need to form a shadow cabinet for the time being. Now, he argues that this is because Pakatan Harapan MPs have already been given certain portfolios to focus on based on specific subjects brought in Parliament. Now, of course, he was responding to an idea brought up by the think tank Ideas, Institute for Democratic Affairs, the Institute for Democracy and Economic Affairs, which said that, which raised the issue that the opposition and Anwar Ibrahim should stop playing the numbers game and instead shift their focus to a policy-driven solution by first forming a shadow cabinet. I'm not quite sure why there's such reluctance on the part of the opposition to form a shadow cabinet, Rad.
Well, Melissa, I think we'll put on the record several other voices that have come up on this issue. Wang Chimot, a political scientist, has mentioned on many occasions the failure of Pakatan Harapan to put together an alternative budget. I think he says is a signal that, a shadow cabinet and what comes with it is in fact necessary. Also, I believe MP for Tuaran, Wilfred Madius Tangau, also made that call. Now, what the reluctance is, of course, best to ask them. They seem to have a response for that, which is that they're doing a good enough job now with having, certain ministers, former ministers play that role. But is it in fact good enough?
I don't know. A shadow cabinet, having shadow ministers, I think would that there are pros to it, right? So you have ministers kind of perhaps looking at certain portfolios who are providing a check and balance, who are providing that closer scrutiny to the issues under that specific portfolio. And I think it also provides a way for the public to know that, okay, the opposition is there and they're doing something and they're providing some checks and balances. There are issues that are being raised and solutions being proposed.
Right. So this is not a general opposition, right? What we have is individuals now staking a claim on that portfolio and making so the public doesn't just get to know what the general Pakatan view on things is.
Right.
They get to know that this is the person that's going to be championing these issues, right? And I think that's what is important. This other thing, of course, Melissa, is that many of the Pakatan Harapan ministers during their 22 months have defected. Two, many of them were actually seen to be seriously deficient in their jobs. And I think what the Malaysian public has come to understand is that changing a government is one thing, but actually when you're in that power seat, right, when you have power, what do you do with it? And we saw a lot of failures during the 22 months. There's some successes, some really sterling efforts, and some people you think, well, these are the future leaders of Malaysia, but there were also a real, deadwood. And I think, and that's the kindest way to say
you're being generous when you're saying
and
that.
So, we know. Don't just tell us you're going to change the government. Tell us who exactly will be taking this position.
So a shadow cabinet could also be, kind of a stepping stone, right? You're preparing certain MPs, certain individuals for perhaps a ministerial portfolio, giving them the practice, giving them the opportunity to really follow that beat. And also, I think having a shadow cabinet could also resolve certain questions about gender representation, ethnic representation, geographical representation. Early on, you have that kind of on the table. You've got the time to think through rather than it be a surprise when you are suddenly in power and selecting a cabinet.
Okay, so now I'm going to put on my realist hat for about 30 seconds, Melissa, and say, well, what is it about our politics today? Extremely fluid, based on coalitions that are not stable. Can this particular state of affairs in Malaysia produce, stable coalitions that can in fact elect, a shadow cabinet?
But is that reason enough not to have a shadow cabinet? Well, I understand that could be jostling for, shadow cabinet positions.
Absolutely, and also because if the formation of the cabinet and the distribution of cabinet seats is dependent on your electoral performance, how can you know beforehand that a number of individuals will in fact make it to the slate? I mean, a small party might have tremendous success and might demand more in terms of representation. The coalition system itself, and especially an unstable coalition system, might in fact negate the possibility of a kind of shadow cabinet idea.
Is it possible for us to rethink our political culture of rewarding electoral performance with a ministerial position? Is that the way we should be thinking about it now? We should break the old habits.
Break old habits, but they're based on political realities and the realities of power in the country. So again, that realist hat on my head, covering the bald spot.
I don't like that realist hat.
No, I don't think so. I think that's why there's probably that reluctance to make such a commitment so early on in the game.
Well, definitely a conversation that we will seek to have further on, consider this. But we're going to take a quick break. And after this, we will take a closer look at a recent report that found that chronic disease and mental illness were far more common in the poorest and the unemployed. Details after this. Stay tuned. Hi, you're watching Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris. With me is Sharad Kutan. Khazanah Research Institute recently released the third and final part of its annual The State of Households report. Now, in this installment of the report, it was titled Social Inequalities and Health in Malaysia, and it looks at the social factors that may affect the health outcomes of Malaysians. Now, two of its co-authors will be joining us on the show tonight. We have first Putri Marjan Megat Muzaffar. She's a researcher at Khazanah Research Institute. Good evening, Marjan. Now, the report argues that health is not just determined by the robustness of and the access to healthcare systems, but rather health outcomes of Malaysians are also affected by social factors like income, living and work conditions, as well as our own behaviour. Now, one of the most interesting things I took away from this report was the prevalence of diabetes, high blood pressure and cholesterol levels, which were among the highest among adults in the bottom 20% income bracket. But then these same diseases showed the lowest prevalence in the T20, the top 20%. Maybe you can begin by explaining what you found in your research to be behind some of these health inequalities.
All right. So before that, just to share with you, so this report is actually part of Khazanah Research Institute's State of Households 2020 series. So it's the third and final installment of the report. So for the first and second part of the report, we talk about welfare of households in terms of income, for example. Whereas in this report, we want to put more focus on health because it is also an important element in measuring well-being. And one of the things that we talk about in our report is that when you talk about health, it is not just about in terms of access, meaning that access to nearby hospitals, for example, or having access to doctors, but whereas there is actually more than that. So in here, we talk about social factors. So as Melissa has mentioned that in the report, we talk about how certain those with lower socioeconomic status have actually higher prevalence of certain diseases or poorer health outcomes. So for instance, those in the bottom quintile, so let's say, for example, if you organize the households into income bracket, right? So for this, we actually use the National Health and Mobility Survey to calculate it. And when we calculated it as in by household income per capita, we see that those in the bottom 20% has a higher blood pressure at 38.3% compared to those in top 20 at 27%. So why do we see these differences happening? So one thing we need to understand that when we talk about health is that there's something we call direct determinants and there's something we call structural determinants. So direct determinants are something that directly affects health. So for example, your psycho-social circumstances, whether or not you're exposed to certain stresses, meaning like stressful working conditions, for example. And then the second bit will be your physical environment. So as Melissa mentioned, so for example, having poor housing conditions. And then the third would be health impacting behaviors. So for instance, your diet, your lifestyle, your physical activities, or for example, when you want to do, for example, if you do like smoking or drinking, so these sort of things will affect your health outcomes. But there's something that we call structural determinants, which actually affect these direct determinants, or something that we call causes of causes.
Right,
So,
but Marjan, before you go on, I mean, it does seem almost unremarkable that, you know, that you should come out with the conclusions you did. I mean, is there anything surprising in the outcomes that poorer people are sicker, perhaps don't get to go to hospital and, you know, deal with those things, or they live in conditions that actually exacerbate all the things that the rest of us are also exposed to? Were there any surprises at all in this survey?
So one thing is something sort of what we expected because of when we compare with how other international studies have done it. So one valuable thing about the report is actually putting the facts into the discussion. So then when we talk about these sort of social factors, then we actually have the data to back it up. Because these sort of things, I think my colleague Naziha will go further into it. If you want to address health outcomes, it is not just the responsibility of the Ministry of Health, because these social factors, for instance, like housing, it's not something that may necessarily be under the purview of Ministry of Health. That's one. Also, when we talk about health, usually then you say that, oh, okay, so that someone is sick. What is the person doing wrong? Is it because that person is not exercising? Is it because that person is not buying healthy food? But then at the same time, imagine, like, for example, a single mother having to work and feed her children and take care of her children. So imagine working early in the morning, preparing food for breakfast, and then having to work full time. At the end of the day, when would she get the time to actually go out and exercise, for instance? And then with like having limited time, so what does she do? She would cook like fried food, for example, because it's actually quicker. Or but because of these sort of limitations, then
Right.
it's not. Yeah, so it puts the burden of health outcomes beyond just the individual.
I find that quite interesting, particularly since the research showed that obesity was increasing at a faster rate among the poor. How do we think about this? You know, the first thing that comes to mind is, you know, the fact that perhaps, you know, health-promoting habits, healthy living, eating healthy seems to be anecdotally more expensive here in Malaysia. But how do we think through? Because you don't necessarily have to spend money to lead a healthy lifestyle, right?
Yep. So again, it's not just the Ministry of Health. So for instance, when we design our houses and when we design our cities, so imagine having public parks being close to PPRs, for example, or when you do, like, for example, when Ministry of Education, when they want to design food programs for children, they can make sure that the food served at canteens are affordable and nutritious across the board. So this will not just be beneficial to those who have, but also those who have not, because these are more of like wider-reaching policies.
Yeah, Marjan, there's some interesting, facts in the report. One, on the question of life expectancy. Malaysians are living longer, but we compare ourselves internationally. Turkey and Thailand seem to have overtaken us on that score. And if you look down at the kind of regional comparisons, while all states, in fact, improved in life expectancy, we see a reversal. There was a reversal in Sabah. A drop of 2 years, in fact, from 75 to 73. How do you explain anomalies like that?
Yeah. So for like these sort of differences, it's very interesting because, like I said before, so when you talk about discussion in terms of like access to healthcare, as in access the access to hospitals, for example, so Malaysia has been very good, has performed very well in terms of those metrics. So, for example, those living near hospitals, about 94% of Malaysians actually live within 5 kilometers of hospitals. But yet, we still see these differences, like Sharat has mentioned. So, for example, someone living in Kuala Lumpur or Sarawak is expected to live 4 years longer than someone living in like Kelantan, Perlis, or Terengganu. So, in our report, we try to sort of like tease out why this is so, but because it's a report, so we can't really like go down like further into it. But one of the things that we see is differences in income, for example. So those with states with higher GDP per capita, like Selangor and Kuala Lumpur, tends to have higher life expectancy compared to the rest. But these sort of things, it's not just, it is definitely beyond the scope, beyond just the healthcare system.
I think that's quite interesting. And just to keep on the topic of life expectancy, what I found interesting also from the report was the proportion of life in poor health. That remains the same despite our kind of life expectancy going up. So in that life in poor health, 12%, I think 12.7% between 1990 and 2019, it kind of remained the same. So can you talk us through how to think this through? I mean, why is it that there is still such a big proportion of our lives that is spent in poor health?
Right. So when we talk about a lot of the metrics when we talk about health looks into longevity, which is living longer, right? And then mortality, which is the rate of dying. But one thing that when you want to discuss about population aging, for example, as in how many of those that age older are living in poor health. So that is where these metrics called healthy life expectancy comes into play. So then you look at it, so imagine this. So imagine if more Malaysians are living longer, but then let's say the life expectancy is at 75.5 using that metric. But then our healthy life expectancy is actually at 65. So it means that 9.5 years of those are in poor health. So what does that mean in terms of having, what does it mean in terms of our preparing our healthcare system, making sure that those that age become more productive members of society. So when we look at health outcomes of Malaysians, then we see a lot of Malaysians having high prevalence of cardiovascular diseases, diabetes, cancers. So these things actually contribute to the increase in proportion of ill health.
All right. Marjan, thank you so much for speaking with us and shedding some light into this report. We're going to take a quick break, but after this, we'll continue the conversation and speak to another co-author of the report. All of that is coming up on Consider This. Stay tuned. Hi, thanks so much for staying with Sharad and I on Consider This. Let's continue our conversation about the Social Inequalities in Health in Malaysia report, which is the third and final part of Khazanah Research's The State of Households 2020 series. Now, we just heard from Putri Marjan, and now her co-author Naziha Muhammad Noor joins us on the line. Good evening, Naziha. Now, work, it provides us with income, which of course can be used to improve healthcare circumstances. But work can be detrimental to our physical health, our mental health. How do we think through these opposing outcomes?
So that's something that really wants to explore in this report. So as you mentioned, work can be a very, very positive contributor to health, because it can give us not just income for us to buy health purchasing goods, but also for a lot of us, it's a source of health insurance as well that our employers sometimes provide. But as you mentioned, it can also be a source of poor health. So when we talk about the relationship between health and work, we tend to talk about occupational injuries and death. And the good news is, on this front, occupational injuries, both fatal and non-fatal, have been on a downward trend for the past 3 decades. But beyond just causing ill health through exposing workers to physical and chemical hazards, work can also cause a poor health through exposing workers to psychosocial hazards. So things like having poor control over your workload, having irregular working hours, having poor participation in the decision-making process. These sorts of things can cause a lot of stressors that internationally studies have shown that there's a correlation between having, a low job status and having poor health outcomes and vice versa. So in Malaysia, we don't really have,
Go ahead, sir.
So in Malaysia, we don't really have enough data to be able to say conclusively whether this is the case. But what we can see is that unpaid workers and homemakers almost consistently have the highest prevalence of conditions like high blood pressure, high cholesterol, and mental health challenges compared to other occupational categories.
Nazia, I was struggling to understand if the study actually says anything that we couldn't have guessed at from the onset. But I do want to actually look at some of the basic assumptions you make in the study. And it says that Malaysia's healthcare system promises universal access to healthcare, but then you go on to say there are other determinants. I want to ask you about the question of the universal access. How universal, genuinely universal is our healthcare system? And to what level? How are we talking about universal healthcare at a very basic level? And then when you go up the ladder, as it were, in the complexity of the cost, then it in fact becomes, the game of the rich will have access and the poor won't.
Absolutely. So just to take your first point about whether or not some of these findings are necessarily surprising, perhaps instinctively, it makes sense that, those in lower socioeconomic groups tend to have poor health outcomes. But if it's so, perhaps so obvious, then why is it that we haven't really tried to capture or report this in terms of improving the health of the population? When we talk about the health of the population, we're still talking about access to healthcare systems. But international studies have shown that actually interactions with the healthcare system, so your interactions with the doctor, with the hospitals, etc., can account for only about 10 to 30% of the population's overall health outcomes. The rest are, by far and large, due to the social factors, things like your environment, your working conditions, your education level, your income level.
But so, Nazia, so the question would then be, should the state be involved in equalizing that which is unequal in society? Can systems, publicly, finance systems, actually equalize outcomes in terms of health?
Yeah, so that is really, it goes back to your earlier question about the universal health coverage, right? So in Malaysia, as Marjan mentioned earlier, yes, headline figures, about 94% of the Malaysian population have access to a healthcare facility or within 5 kilometers of their living, of where they live. But in reality, what we see is that because we have this two-tiered system of both public and private healthcare system, where, theoretically, anyone can have access to the public healthcare system, but to reduce some of the pressures on the public healthcare system, the rich, those who can afford it, can get healthcare in the private healthcare facilities. Right. But what we actually see from data is that while this is generally true for more minor health conditions and for outpatient care services, where we have more of the higher income groups going to private healthcare, the trend starts to become less obvious when it comes to more major health conditions and when people are seeking inpatient care, where treatment costs are a lot higher. Then we see less of this effect. So more and more people start to use public healthcare facilities.
Okay. Well, but
so this, this just underscores the importance of actually having a well-funded public healthcare system.
But, the thing about the report is it also highlights the fact that, health outcomes are not just based on healthcare systems or access to healthcare systems. And I think your colleague Marjan said, health is really just not the responsibility of just the Ministry of Health. And I'm wondering, Nazia, what would you like to see in terms of policy changes or interventions that would perhaps equalize the healthcare outcomes of all Malaysians, regardless of income?
So one of the interventions that is generally very, very effective that benefits the wider population is more investment in our preventative care services. So preventative care services are things like health education campaigns, vaccination campaigns, things like health screening programs. And these kinds of programs and even things like school feeding programs, for example, where they can benefit a wider population rather than just in targeted groups, or certainly just not those who can afford these kinds of services. And for the past many years, on the whole, we've invested around 6 to 7% of our total healthcare expenditure on preventative care services only. By comparison, we spend about 70% of our total healthcare expenditure on curative care. And the thing with preventative care, we are facing this problem of burden of rising healthcare costs. Right. But what studies have again shown is that if you invest more in preventative care, not only will be more likely that it will benefit the wider population, it will actually also, in the long run, reduce the need to spend on on curative care.
Okay.
So this is
Nazia,
one of the interventions we would like to push for.
thank you so much for joining us on the show, sharing your insights about this report. Thank you for your time. Now, before we close the show, there's been some breaking news. Singapore has received its first shipment of COVID-19 vaccines this evening, making it the first country in Asia to take the vaccine developed by Pfizer and BioNTech. Now, the shipment was transported via Singapore Airlines freighter, which departed on Sunday from Brussels, and it landed in Singapore Changi Airport earlier this evening. Singapore Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong announced on the 14th of December that Singapore authorities had approved the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine for pandemic use and that the first shipment would arrive by end December. So the vaccine shipment comes a week before Singapore is set to go into phase 3 of reopening on the 28th of December. So we're going to keep a close eye on the story as it develops. Stay tuned to Astro AWANI for updates on this. I'm Melissa Idris.
And I'm Sharad Kuttan, signing off for the evening.
Thank you so much for watching and good night.